Hi everybody, thank you for coming along to today's webinar. My name is Harriet Downey and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Conservation Evidence Group. And with me today as well is Tom White, who's a PhD candidate in the Conservation Evidence Group. And today we're going to talk to you about how to use evidence to improve biodiversity impact mitigation. So we are going to record the session and send it out afterwards, so you can share it with colleagues later on. And if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, if you can put them in the Q&A box throughout the talk, and we'll answer them all at the end. And if you have any sort of technical queries, if you can put those in the chat, and those will pop up and we can deal with those straight away. So that's all of that for now. So I'll hand over to Tom, who's going to start the presentation.
Thanks, Harriet, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to start today by giving a bit of context about biodiversity impact mitigation and why it's becoming more important, and then talking about the benefits of evidence-based practice, and if you make that evidence-based, what how you can make your actions that you put in place to reduce your impact on biodiversity more effective and potentially benefit your company or organization as well. So many recent reports have highlighted the loss of biodiversity at a global scale. The Living Planet report released by the WWF last year highlighted that on average, populations of monitored species across the world have declined by 68% between 1970 and 2016. The Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a group of scientists and practitioners who reported to governments around the world, they highlighted that 66% of the marine environment is now degraded by human activity and 75% of the terrestrial surface of the planet. The same report estimates that 1 million species are now at risk of extinction. These are shocking statistics that highlight the significance of biodiversity loss globally. And at the same time as this, we're realizing the importance of biodiversity, the importance of species and natural ecosystems for the provision of services on which humanity depends. These services range from provisioning services, so things like forestry products, fishery products, agricultural systems, to regulating services where natural ecosystems can help regulate global climates and provide habitat for pollinators and healthy soils, for example. And yet, the loss of biodiversity is causing the degradation of many of these services, which is starting to be realized as a severe risk to industry and to global society. You can see in this graph here that this is released by the World Economic Forum every year, looking at the biggest global risks to industry and society. And you can see on the top right of this graph that biodiversity loss is now highlighted as one of the biggest risks in terms of its likelihood of occurring and of its impact to global society. And this translates to risks to businesses and to organizations, because those businesses depend upon those, just as we all do, they depend upon those services that are provided by nature. A business may, for example, need access to clean water for its factories or agricultural products in its supply chains, which, as those services provided by nature start to be degraded, can cause businesses to be disrupted and physical disruption of their activities. There are also transition risks as national governments, as financiers, as wider society starts to care more about nature. Businesses and organizations and economic activities in general are often negatively impacting on wildlife. And those negative impacts now start to represent transition risks, where there may be operational, reputational, or financial risks for the companies that are negatively impacting wildlife. And so it's now increasingly required for organizations to start engaging with their biodiversity impacts. They want to in the first place measure them, and then to think about how they can mitigate against those biodiversity impacts. And that might be, that's often done as part of the environmental and social impact assessment process for projects. And it's often driven by regulatory requirements of national governments, telling organizations that they now have to engage with biodiversity impacts. There may be financier requirements, stipulating that if loans are to be given to specific projects or companies, they have to meet certain biodiversity related criteria. or maybe increasingly voluntary commitments by companies to achieve no net loss or net gain for biodiversity. And the mitigation hierarchy is a stepwise approach that's been seen as the best way to engage with your biodiversity impacts in order to achieve no net loss or net gain. And how this works is if you've got a project at the early stages of project planning, that project might have a potential impact on biodiversity. And you first look at early project stages, how you could potentially avoid that impact. And then once you've avoided impact, how you could minimize that impact to the greatest extent possible. And then when impacts still remain, you start to look at restoration activities that you could conduct on site, and then investing in offsets and compensatory programs such as restoration projects elsewhere, so that overall, as a result of your activities, you achieve no net loss of wildlife and biodiversity overall, or even better, net gain. And to achieve this, you have to take many actions across a project's life cycle to protect and restore biodiversity. And this schematic here tries to show that. You see on the left here, a predicted project right at the early stages of a project planning or design might have a specific biodiversity impact on wildlife, on habitats and species. And over the course of the project's life cycle, with project stages in the orange arrows here, you'll work to reduce that biodiversity impact by first avoiding impact, then minimizing impact, looking at restoration, and finally at offset measures, so that overall you can achieve positive outcomes for biodiversity as a result of your project. But it does, as I said just a second ago, it does take many different actions to protect and restore biodiversity. And if we look at a specific example of a power line or a transmission line, if you're designing a power line project, unfortunately, those projects often have detrimental impacts on large and at-risk bird species, such as this white stork or this Spanish imperial eagle here. And so you have to think at very early project stages what you might do about that. And so right at the stage where you're designing the project, you might think about placing that line underground or changing the placement of the line to avoid high-risk areas that are used by those bird species. Once you've done that, you might start to think about how you could minimize risk by putting bird flight diverters on the lines or changing the pylon designs to minimize the risk of electrocution. You might start to think about restoring habitat underneath the line once you've constructed the project. And then lastly, you might also want to invest in offset programs or habitat restoration elsewhere, or provide resources to research. And so with all these different actions, deciding about which action to actually put in place is complicated. You need to think about, is this action effective? How much will it cost? Is it actually feasible for you to do? And at the same time, the individuals and the consultants who are often making these decisions have to work on other factors. They have to think about the climate and the water and the social impacts of given projects, as well as ensuring that this project is delivered on time and on budget. And assessing whether an action is actually likely to work as to be beneficial for wildlife requires looking at a range of different sources of information. You might want to think about local knowledge of your experience of doing it in the past, of other people's experience. Think about how much it costs. Think about what the best practice guidance says. Think about what resources you have available. Is it feasible? And also to look at the scientific evidence. Is there an evidence base that backs up that this action will actually be effective? And that's a difficult thing to do. And so I'm now going to talk a bit about the benefits of ensuring those actions are based on the best available evidence. And then Harriet will take over and talk about the tools that we and others have been developing that can help you engage and assess that evidence base in a way that is not too time consuming and hopefully relatively easy to use. So to start with, obviously we're going to talk a lot about evidence here. So to start with, it's good to talk through some definitions. And by evidence, we mean relevant information that is used to assess one or more hypotheses related to a question of interest. It's information that's used to back up a given assertion. And that can be information from various sources. It can be your knowledge and experience. It can be the experience and knowledge of a group of experts that you've consulted. Or it can indeed be scientific evidence, which specifically refers to information that's been collected using the scientific method And this includes published, peer-reviewed studies and unpublished studies in theses and reports. And if we use that evidence in practice, evidence-based practice requires that decisions are based on the best available current, valid, and relevant evidence. And if you move towards evidence-based practice, you can improve the effectiveness of your biodiversity mitigation actions. And this approach originated in healthcare in this book by Archie Cochrane in the 1970s, where he advocated for healthcare decisions, for decisions about healthcare interventions to be made based on scientific evidence of whether they worked or not. And since then, the sector has been completely revolutionized. The treatments that individuals receive in many countries around the world are no longer based solely on an individual clinician's knowledge, but they're based on the scientific evidence of whether that intervention, whether that drug or that treatment is effective and safe for administration in the population covered by the healthcare system. And I think the COVID vaccines are a really good example of this, where we've seen quite unusually in the scientific headlines, in the headlines of the mainstream media, that these scientific studies showing whether vaccines are effective and how safe they are and their different side effects. And we've also seen the regulatory system that's now in place here in the UK and in other countries around the world that shows that it looks at that information and judges whether those vaccines are effective and safe to be deployed in the wider population. And since this book by Archie Cochrane and the development of evidence-based medicine is spread into other disciplines, into social care, public health, and increasingly in the environmental sciences. And using evidence improves decision-making. It can allow you to understand the likely consequences of actions to your best of your ability. It can help you collate and synthesize evidence from various different sources. It can reduce bias in your decision-making as to whether you think something works or you think it doesn't. And it can increase the transparency of your decisions. So if someone questions why you've put a particular action in place, you can say, well, it was based on this study or this group of experts that we consulted. But overall, what that leads to is if you use evidence in your biodiversity impact mitigation decisions, you can increase the effectiveness of your management actions, which is good for biodiversity, but also good for organizations to avoid investing in things that are ineffective for reducing or compensating biodiversity impact. It can also optimize the use of funds and prevent the waste of resources on things that are ineffective. And just to give one sort of really good example of evidence-based practice, in the 60s and 70s, sudden infant death syndrome sadly became epidemic and reached quite high levels. And this is where babies were suddenly dying mainly in their sleep. And at its peak, babies in rich countries were dying at a rate of 1 in 250 live births. It was found from scientific studies that putting babies to sleep on their back reduced these risks dramatically, and it was subsequently promoted in healthcare campaigns in many different countries. And following these recommendations, over the course of many years, you can see in the red bars on this graph, deaths from SIDS fell from 1 in 250 to 1 in 3,000. What this shows is that evidence-based medicine really saves lives, but you can see there that there was a delay in this recommendation being put into practice. So evidence-based practice in this case did save lives, but it only worked once we actually paid attention to the science. And it begs the question is how many people died due to the delay in bringing this evidence into practice. So you may be wondering now how this relates to biodiversity impact mitigation, but there are increasing expectations for the management of species and habitats in industrial projects to be based on good practice guidance and evidence. This is just one example here from the UK Guidelines on Ecological Impact Assessment from SIEM in the UK and Ireland, which states that mitigation should be based on good practice guidance and evidence. And certainly there are some examples where this really isn't done. These are what are known as bat gantries, which are structures that have been placed across the road in the UK in some locations at a cost of 2.5 million pounds. And these structures were designed because bats like to follow linear structures in the landscape. And so the thought was that if they were placed over roads, that the bats would cross the roads at a higher level and avoid collision with cars during the night. Unfortunately, the scientific evidence showed subsequent to many of these being built, that they didn't work. There was no reduction in bat mortality. And yet these are still used across the UK as a mitigation measure. This led to bad pressure, and from a biodiversity perspective, no reduction in the mortality of bats. If any of you have ever travelled from Cambridge to Thetford on the A11, you'll see some of these structures there. As another example, current road mitigation advice for amphibians is frequently used to create safe crossings for newts. But at the time of this study here, there were no studies actually testing the effectiveness of those actions on newts. And yet if we want, there are some fantastic examples of really effective things you can do to avoid, to minimize, and to compensate for impacts on wildlife. And if we want these actions to be effective, we need to pay attention to the scientific evidence, which can seem like quite an overwhelming task. So Harriet's going to talk about the evidence base in conservation now, and the tools and the methods that we're developing and others are developing that can help you to easily use that in your work. So over to you, Harriet.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So as Tom was saying, evidence-based practice relies on there being sufficient scientific evidence available. And this is increasingly the case in conservation. So we can see that in 1995, there was only about 200 papers, including the words biodiversity and conservation, published in the literature. But by 2018, this number had jumped to over 5,000 papers. And it's been estimated that in 2018, about 14 or more papers on biodiversity conservation were published every single day. And there's also been more diversity in where the evidence is coming from. So again, in 1995, these are the countries producing the evidence. But if we jump forward again to 2018, we can see that there has been a big increase in the number of studies coming from different countries. So this is leading to a better global evidence base. And a lot of the evidence available is relevant to biodiversity impact mitigation. So I've just picked out a couple of studies here. So there's this really, really interesting study from May and colleagues in 2020 that showed simply painting one blade of a wind turbine black reduced the annual fatality rate of birds by 70% relative to controls. And there was an even larger effect shown for raptors. So no white-tailed eagles were recorded to collide with the wind turbines after they'd had their blade painted. There was a second paper by Ferrer et al. In 2020 that showed using bird flight diverters reduced mortality by between 40 and 70%. And then this final study is incredibly impressive, showing that applying UV lights to power lines reduced the collisions with sandhill cranes by 98%. And all of these are, reasonably cost-effective measures to put in place as well. And so there's all of this evidence available, but this can actually be quite overwhelming and can sometimes contribute to the evidence not actually being used because there's so much of it available. And this is where we reach something that's often referred to as the research practice gap or space, where there's research available, but it's not actually being used in practice. And so there's been lots of studies undertaken in the conservation and environmental science sector to try and look at why people don't use scientific evidence in practice. And there's been a huge number of barriers shown, but the common ones on top of the scale of literature include there's not enough time to access, read and review it all. There's difficulties just with access. A lot of the evidence, the scientific evidence is behind paywalls, or sometimes people don't know where to look. There can be too much jargon, either scientific jargon or statistics that make it complicated to interpret. There can sometimes be some real organizational challenges with getting evidence used. It's just not a priority for an organization in their decision making. And often the right evidence just isn't available. So there's a lot of research being produced, but the researchers aren't necessarily answering the questions that practitioners want to know. And so all of these studies have shown that usually decision makers are not prioritizing using scientific evidence in their decision making. So there's this one from the UK in 2014, and then there's been other studies from Australia, Switzerland, Madagascar, other places showing the same trends. But there are tools available that can help access the evidence base and improve decision making. So I'm going to go through some of them now. And so the first one that I like to talk about is the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And this is a group that produces systematic reviews and maps for a wide range of subjects in the environmental science. So this means they pull together the available evidence for a particular topic and summarize the overall findings of multiple studies, reports, and expert opinions. Or they produce maps that help identify what literature is available and where the gaps are. So we can see some examples that are relevant to biodiversity mitigation include things like the effectiveness of terrestrial protected areas, whether transportation infrastructure verges constitute habitat for biodiversity, and whether roadside vegetation management affects the diversity of vascular plants and invertebrates. So you can go on that website and you can see all of the different reviews that they have available. And then the second tool that's available is conservation evidence. And conservation evidence is a free resource that summarizes the evidence for conservation interventions. So this could be whether you want to sow a wildflower strip for birds on a farm, whether you want to put a pond on your nature reserve, but also numerous actions that you could take for restoration or mitigation activities. So it gathers together the evidence using a technique called subject-wide evidence synthesis, which basically means that journals are systematically searched issue by issue for papers that directly test a conservation intervention and reports the results. And these results are gathered together in what we call synopses. And these synopses are grouped by either taxonomic groups, so we've got amphibians, primates, terrestrial mammals, or by habitat, so farmland, forest, peatland. And these represent a summary of all of the evidence available for the management of that taxa or habitat. And these include measures across the mitigation hierarchy, but are often focused on restoration and minimization. And then the evidence for these actions are collated together in an annual publication called What Works in Conservation. So each action is given a score for the overall effectiveness. And this effectiveness score is voted for by a panel of experts after reviewing the evidence. And so the categories range from beneficial through to likely to be harmful. So What Works in Conservation and all of the synopses can be downloaded for free as a PDF, or you can look at them interactively on the database. So if we were to go on to conservation evidence to try and work out whether bat gantries might be a good mitigation measure to use, you could type bat gantry into the search bar, and you would see quite quickly that this action has been assigned the category of unlikely to be beneficial based upon the available scientific studies. But something that's quite nice about the database is on that page, you'll get a list of related actions. And this could allow you to come up with some alternative solutions. So you see that bat gantries might not be the most effective measure, but then you could see something like installing an underpass or a culvert has been assigned a category of likely to be beneficial based upon the available studies. So within quite a short period of time, you would be able to find yourself an alternative measure. So other examples of the kind of thing you might find on there that are relevant to mitigation include things like increasing the wind speed at which turbines become operational. So this means that at low wind speed, when bats are most active, their chance of collision with the wind turbine is eliminated. And this is quite beneficial to companies because as this occurs at low wind speeds, when the turbines aren't generating as much electricity, it will be less costly for the company as well. And a third example that we've pulled out to show you is using acoustic devices to deter marine and freshwater mammals from an area to reduce noise exposure. And this is quite an interesting one because cetaceans can be negatively impacted from noise pollution in the driving of marine infrastructure into the seabed. And so there were some studies undertaken that showed that using acoustic devices to deter mammals where wind farm construction sites were located reduced the activities and sighting of harbour porpoises at various distances. But it was also shown that high amplitude acoustic devices could also cause hearing damage to target and non-target mammal species and disrupt some of the behaviour. And so this action has actually been assigned this category of trade-off between benefit and harms, as you can see there. And then the final example I want to point out is a very commonly used measure, which is just providing artificial nesting sites for songbirds. So you can see the 65 studies available for this intervention, and it's been assigned this overall category of beneficial. But it should be noted that there is a lot of variation around the world. And another important thing to note when you're thinking about these actions is how exactly you're going to undertake them. So this is a photograph taken from a paper that was in Science a few years ago, showing that you really need to think about what you're doing just beyond the action. So these bird nest boxes were installed at huge densities under the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. And I'm sure most ornithologists would tell you that birds would not breed at this higher density. But due to the lack of that information being included in the decision, these kinds of actions have actually gone ahead. And so I'd just like to point you now to another resource that's available. So Applied Ecology Resources is a new online repository from the British Ecological Society. And it houses reports that haven't been published in peer-reviewed journals. So this includes things like consultant reports, NGO reports, reports from governmental organisations. And to date, they have around 6,000 available on the website, and they will be continually updating. So that's another resource you can go and use. And then just to quickly go through a number of others that are available for more specific subjects. So there's the Nature-Based Solutions platform. Panorama collates case studies on different biodiversity management actions. There's the CABI Invasive Species Compendium, and then the Conservation Measures Partnership also provides case studies for you to have a look at. And so those data sets that I've just talked about are largely there to tell you something about the effectiveness of particular actions. But of course, you also need to think about the evidence of species and habitat status and threats, and the likely impacts and dependencies as well. And this can help guide avoidance measures at early project stages. So there's a couple of examples of tools out there that can help in these stages. So there's something called IBAT, and this allows users to assess the risks of projects or portfolios by overlaying these locations with evidence on species ranges, protected areas, and key biodiversity areas. So it's a subscription service, so you could send your development projects to IBAT and they will send you back a report telling you all of this information. And then there's also something called Encore, which allows you to understand the risks associated with different types of sectors and localities, and what the likely impacts of a construction project is on a species, and what are the dependencies that it has on nature as well. Okay, so those are some of the tools that are available out there, but of course, if you know of any others that we haven't covered, please feel free to put them in the chat and share with other people here today. But once you've found your evidence and you're in this position to make your decision, there's still other factors that you need to consider when you are interpreting it for your specific situation. So I just want to point out some other things that need considering. And so this includes things like checking the source of the evidence. Is it from a scientific peer-reviewed article or mainstream media? What's the type of evidence? Is it a synthesis of multiple studies, or is it a single study? Is it anecdotal perhaps? And also thinking about the strength of the evidence. If it's a synthesis, was it the results strongly positive and all the studies agreed, or was it only weakly positive or quite mixed in the results? And how does that affect how you might use that information? The quality of evidence is related to the type, but you also need to think about sample sizes that have been used in studies, how much replication was there, and the type of experimental design used. So was there a very robust experimental design like a randomized controlled trial, or was a simpler design like before and after? And the quantity of evidence as well, how many sources of information do you have? And the relevance, is it specific to your context, the specific species or habitat or geographic location, or is it somewhat indirectly related? So it's within the same taxonomic group or the same biome, but not totally related to what you're looking at. So those are some things to consider about the actual source of evidence, but of course, you also need to consider things such as costs. So How much will the intervention cost you? Are there any financial benefits associated with undertaking that intervention? And what's the acceptability of undertaking that action? Is it compatible with the values of your organization? And is it acceptable to all of your relevant stakeholders? And also the feasibility, simply is this intervention possible given your context and your resources? And so consulting the scientific evidence in full for every single decision would be too overwhelming for anyone to undertake. So you can do things to prioritise where you place effort in reviewing the evidence. So the field of decision science has come up with lots of frameworks to help people do this. And lots of studies have shown that the average person will have to make hundreds to thousands of decisions a year within their work environment. And so obviously it isn't possible to do a thorough evidence review for every single one of these decisions. So what they suggest is that you break it down into these different categories. So you can categorize decisions by no-brainers, you just carry on doing what you're doing. Those that are of little consequence, so maybe if you're putting up 1 or 2 nest boxes, you might not necessarily feel you need to do a thorough evidence review for that. And then there's those decisions where it's worth consulting the evidence. But again, this can be divided into brief evidence reviews. So maybe this is a topic that you've done a review of recently, that you have good knowledge of. Or for a thorough evidence review, this might be for topics that are culturally or politically sensitive, that will have large impact, or where you have little experience or knowledge yourself in that area. And using guidance that is evidence-based is a good way to ensure that your own work is evidence-based, while also minimizing the time and effort required to review the evidence. So there is increasingly good evidence-based guidance available, such as the new IUCN guidance on wind and renewables. And at Conservation Evidence, we've been working with SAIM and a number of other organizations on creating standards for producing evidence-based guidance to help guidance producers make sure that they are providing robust recommendations. And another great thing to have when you're making your decisions is just ensuring you have a structured approach. So this makes sure that you're not skipping any important steps, you're not missing any important information, and you have a good method to bring together these different bits of information. And there's lots of processes already available out there. There's structured decision-making, multi-criteria decision-making, risk analysis. But at Conservation Evidence, we have been working on a simple tool for people to use in their work. So the evidence to decision tool, you can go online and search it, is a new tool. And this is just to help users bring together all the different evidence for a decision on what actions they might undertake. So you just fill in the prompt boxes, and then it produces a report for you at the end, so that you have a record of why you made that decision when you're reviewing at a later date. So if you go to the website that's there, this is a tool that we're continuously getting feedback from and updating. So if you want to take a look and feedback to us, that would be great. So the other thing that you want to consider as well is just ensuring you include the right people in your decision making. You need not just consult the scientific evidence, but think about the site-based practitioners and what they know, land managers and other advisors, the local community and any information they might have, to make sure that those are all incorporated. And the next thing I think is really important is just to not feel constrained by what you already do. A lot of ineffective practices continue to be used because decision makers don't look beyond their current knowledge. So solution scanning is a way to learn about other options of what you can undertake. So this is something that you can actually try on the Conservation Evidence website. So you could search wind turbine, for example, within the BAT synopsis, and it would come up with a list of possible actions that you might take and the evidence available for those. And you might find something new on there. And then the final thing I just want to touch on is just considering if there's any ways you can avoid bias and bypasses in your decision making. We all have inherent biases in what we do, and you can really challenge yourself to avoid this in your decision making and convince yourself why this is going to work. And again, there's lots of good frameworks already out there for how you do this. So things like Devil's Advocate, project premortems, and forecasting can all help you in this. So the final thing that I just want to touch on before we go to questions is thinking about not just using evidence, but also creating new evidence during your work. So adaptive management is commonly undertaken by lots of conservation practitioners and consultants in their work. And this relies on monitoring of actions and documenting whether they've worked or not, and updating your project accordingly. And if actions are monitored in the correct way, this can be really beneficial for helping build the global evidence base. And this can be really important because, unfortunately, there are really large gaps in the evidence base. So, for example, when we produce a new synopsis at Conservation Evidence, we're able to see which actions there's no evidence for. And usually we find that over a quarter of the actions have no evidence behind them. And one of our synopsis, the primate synopsis, I think it's around 70% of the actions have no evidence behind them. And this doesn't mean that the actions have never been tested. It might just be that the information has never been shared. And so that's also a really important part of the process. And because in industry, consultants and conservationists are putting interventions in place all the time, if you think about designing your projects in the right way, this could generate some really useful data that will benefit not only your own projects, but the wider community. And thinking about those large evidence gaps, should hopefully convince you to consider also publishing this work. And this should be whether the action worked or not. A lot of journals are specifically looking for information on actions that have not worked, because there are problems with publication bias as well, which distorts the evidence base. So there is shortly to be some guidance on designing experiments coming out. So this was led by someone at Endangered Landscapes Programme in collaboration with Conservation Evidence and numerous other organisations. And this guidance on designing experiments in your existing projects is to hopefully show you that it doesn't have to be overly time-consuming or costly. And there's also guidelines available to help you quickly write up this work to share. And there's numerous outlets for where you can submit this type of work. So Conservation Evidence has its own journal. There's Conservation Science and Practice evidence articles, and there's also Ecological Solutions and Evidence, a new journal from the British Ecological Society. So just to leave it there, in conclusion, just to re-emphasize that biodiversity impact mitigation is increasingly important for industry. And using scientific evidence and other forms of evidence can help increase the effectiveness of your actions and prevent resources from being wasted. But using scientific evidence and other evidence is really tricky, and it's only one part of the decision making. But there are tools out there that exist to help you access that evidence base and improve your decisions. Designing your actions carefully can help fill gaps in the evidence base, benefiting not only yourself, but the global community. And really, collaborations and knowledge exchange between scientists and decision makers are also key in helping improve this evidence base. Like I said earlier, one of the major barriers to evidence use is that often researchers aren't producing the information that end users want. And so getting a two-way dialogue started can really help guide researchers to what people want from them. And then just to talk about some future directions here, what we're doing at Conservation Evidence. So we run a partnership program. We have a number of partners involved, and we use this program to strengthen researcher practitioner relationships, so get feedback on the kind of evidence that people want, to share more knowledge, but also to co-design and develop tools to help overcome some of the barriers to scientific evidence use. So you can, if you're interested in looking at more about that, you can go on the website and find information about that. We're continuing to develop and review the evidence base. So by 2024, we should have covered all taxonomic groups and habitats. And after that, we will just be moving to rolling updates of the evidence. And we're also developing tools and evidence-based guidance to aid in decision-making, similar to the one that I showed you earlier. So that's all from me. And Tom, I think, is just going to quickly tell you a bit more about another project that we'd love to hear from you about.
Yeah, so one of the tools that we're currently trying to develop is a tool to help organisations and businesses assess the cost effectiveness of different possible mitigation actions and restoration actions. And we want to talk to businesses to find out what challenges you have in practice, in making decisions and in assessing cost effectiveness, and to get your thoughts on the sort of tools that would be helpful to you. So if that's of interest, we'd love to hear from you, and you can get in touch with the emails on the screen there, or put a message in the chat. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, if you could put that in the Q&A box, and Harriet and I will try and answer them.
Yeah, so we do have a couple of questions already, so I'll start going through them. So we have one from Lucy here that says, it seems like quite an effort to review scientific literature on an ongoing basis to keep the database up to date. How often is the information updated? And is it done ad hoc or in bulk every couple of months? So just to answer that specifically for conservation evidence, so the way that it works is someone from the team will go out and scan all of the journals, all of the relevant journals, and pull out any articles that are testing an intervention. And then they go into our sort of master database. And then that information is used to create the individual synopses. And usually individual synopses are created on demand. So someone will fund a particular synopsis to be produced. And some of them, there's not very much information, so they'll be produced very quickly. And for some of them, like terrestrial mammals, it took quite a few years, because as you can imagine, for terrestrial mammals, there's quite a lot of evidence out there. And then, so it's sort of on a demand basis, and then they're updated. So annually is the plan to start updating them. So the bat synopsis is updated every year. And there's been 4 editions of the bat synopsis so far. The bird synopsis will also be updated this year. But it is, like you say, it is quite an effort to review all of the literature. So we are currently looking, we're working with the computer science department at the University of Cambridge, looking at ways to automate the updates. And this will obviously help us do it a lot quicker. But at the moment, it is all manual. So it relies on people doing it. And so you can see when you go on an individual synopsis, you will see the publication date of the synopsis, and you will see when there is a planned update available for. So hopefully that answers your question. So then the next question. So the next question is from Christian Newman. So how do you compare between actions that might show that there is evidence that something works, but help to make decisions is the most cost effective or provides the most benefit? So Tom, do you want to answer that one?
It's a good question, Christian. So it's quite a common scenario, right, where something might be very beneficial, but it also costs more money, or it might even be less beneficial than what you're putting in place and less costly. Those situations are quite difficult to deal with. To make a decision in those contexts is difficult, and there are tools that we're trying to work on. As I was saying, we're trying to look at the cost effectiveness of different approaches and tools that can help businesses decide upon those. But when you're in that gray area of where you don't know if something's more beneficial and less costly, that's a win-win situation. And if something is less beneficial and more costly, you know not to do it. But in that gray area, it's much more difficult to make decisions, and we're trying to work on that. So we'd love to hear from any of you who have any ideas there.
Okay, great. So there is one more question from John, who says that he thinks the slide answers the question, but maybe I'll read it out and answer again, just in case it's for anyone else's benefit. So how should one weigh the value of each study, given differences in study design, sample size, or other factors, especially where the results appear equivocal? Is it simply a weight of evidence approach? So I think, yeah, that was the slide that sort of was talking about other things to consider when you're reviewing the evidence. And yes, so there's things like study design, sample size, and then relevance as well. And usually those things, it's up to the individual to sort of weight that evidence, because you would know for your situation sort of the relevance for you. So I hope that that has answered your question, but feel free to write it again if it hasn't. Okay, so the next question, when there is clear evidence that an intervention could work to mitigate biodiversity loss, does anyone then try to make the particular approach a legal requirement? Tom, do you want to?
So I think it's an interesting comparison to healthcare here. In healthcare, it's embedded in the UK, at least in law, that if something's proven to be effective and cost effective, then it should be funded by the NHS, and that's embedded in the national decision making process. In conservation, it's not quite as simple as that. I think a lot of the governmental organisations are on board, but conservation evidence and these other institutions that we've been talking about are not linked explicably with that process, and so there isn't a sort of national decision-making process for interventions like that. But if something is proven to be effective, I would hope that it would eventually be put into legislation. If you have anything else to say there, Harriet?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because, yeah, I suppose even if the evidence shows that an intervention could work, a lot of the time people make decisions based upon other factors, and so it can be difficult. And also, showing things like with the bat gantries, the authors of that study did write a report and send it to kind of the relevant authorities who did not pay attention to it. So part of it, I think, does also rely on researchers sharing their work and making sure it goes to the right people to try and push those things a bit more as well. It can be a very tricky process, as we often find. So there's a quick question from Michael saying, do we have any material that shows the process behind the conservation evidence database? So we do have a paper that explains the methods in quite detail. It is not one page, but I think it's certainly something. If you go on the website, there is explanations of how the database is put together, and there is a video on there as well that explains it in a bit more detail. But we can certainly try and put together a bit more of a friendly version of the published paper about the methods for people, if that's helpful. Okay. So a question from Karen, are there any links between your work and the DEFRA metric for biodiversity net gain? Tom, do you want to take that one?
So not explicitly, but I think there is a link in that if you want to achieve net gain or no net loss or net gain as a result of your project, the things that you put in place to say that you've improved that metric, improved that the DEFRA biodiversity metric, you have to do actions to do that. You have to put in place restoration actions at another site or within your site, and to do that, those actions would benefit from being evidence-based, and that can improve the effectiveness of those and the likelihood of actually reaching those goals set out in the management plans.
Great. And we do have one final question. We do have a few more minutes, so if anyone else has another question they want answered, please do feel free to put it in the Q&A. So Christian asks, how much engagement have you had with regulators in different countries? So we do have conversations with regulators in different countries. So you've mentioned the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have discussions with Parks Canada and organizations like that about their evidence use strategies. Yeah, lots of people are engaged in trying to understand how they can incorporate evidence both into their own plans or into their funding applications and things like that. And usually that's done through the partnership program I mentioned, through this Evidence Champions program, where an organization can commit to doing one or more things to show that they are committed to undertaking evidence-based conservation. So you could go and have a look on that page, and it will show you some of the people that we work with and some of the categories that they sign up to. And those are generally the kinds of conversations that we have with different regulators. Okay, so then the final one. So from Tony says, do you feel that the evidence is being gathered to demonstrate that district level licensing is effective for great crested newt conservation? Tom, do you want to take that?
I think so I'm not an expert on amphibian conservation. I know there is a lot on great crested newts in the database. And a member of our team, Sylvia Petrovan, is an expert on amphibian conservation. I think it'd be really interesting to have a conversation with you. So if you Tony, if you could send me an email with the tvw27@cam.ac.uk email address there, and I can forward a query to Sylvia.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think that's all of the questions we've had so far. There is a couple more minutes, so if anyone wants to type in anything last minute, please feel free to do so. Or if you have questions that come up afterwards, please do feel free to get in touch. Our emails are there. You can also find them very easily on the Conservation Evidence website. So thank you again for coming along. Like we said, we have recorded the webinar, so it will be emailed to you and put online. And enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.